Hello. There we go. Okay, now I'm seeing output. Okay. Excellent. Minor settings change. Excellent. All right, so last time we left off after finishing chapter 9. So today, since I have time, we will do chapters 10 and 11 of Days of Rage. Yes, it is excellent. It is most excellent when we can read without actually reading. I have done this myself for many, many, many intellectual works where we can actually consume the information, the knowledge required, yet not actually have to spend the time reading and sitting down reading an actual book. Although I do find reading books still very useful indeed. Like I actually still enjoy reading a lot. Like I'm often accused of being able to read 5 books at once at the same time. Of course, they don't all get finished at the same time, but that's a different story. Yes. Welcome, Hitman. Welcome, Cody Bassett. Welcome one, welcome all. I see multiple people in the chat. This is great, excellent. A lot of people got the message, I think. So without further ado, we will get right into it. This is chapter 10. The title is We Got Pretty Small, and it's the Weather Underground and the FBI. So this is the interaction between these two organizations between 1971 and 1972. The Weather leadership's narrow escape from the FBI in March 1971 and the unprecedented raid on one of its San Francisco apartments, what came to be known in Weather lore as the Encirclement, marked a turning point for the organization. Though it would continue to mount actions and issue communiques, Weather would never again be as active or as relevant as it was during its first year underground. And these organizations obviously don't last very long. Its numbers were dwindling. There is ample evidence, in fact, that after mid-1971, Weather was a far smaller organization than has previously been understood. 400 radicals had attended the Flint War Council. Maybe 100 went underground. Maybe 50 remained active after the townhouse. The precise number of later cadres may never be known, in part because many people called themselves weathermen despite doing little clandestine work. In 1972, for example, the Los Angeles Collective consisted of 6 or 7 people who never participated in a single bombing. One estimate puts 35 people underground during the 1972-73 timeframe, a count endorsed by several alumni. But the number who actually performed clandestine work, who carried out bombings after the middle of 1971, was smaller still. We lost most of the people after the townhouse, says Ron Fliegelman. After the Encirclement, we lost even more. I'm telling you, we were down to 10 or 15. The leadership, me, the Cathys, that's Cathy Wilkerson and Kathy Boudin, Paul Bradley. The core group, the ones who did things, was 10 or 12 people, no more than 15. Now, I'll just remind the audience that Paul Bradley is a Weather Underground pseudonym. That's not that person's real name. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing, says Brian Flanagan. People like me who were above ground could do a lot more things. I mean, how many people did you really need underground at that point? It's true. We got pretty small, says Rick Ayers. A lot of people went up. He means above ground here. We sent a lot of people up. That was actually a conscious decision. We wanted a new sort of organization with members above ground where they could do more for us. So you had an underground structure where the members weren't all fugitives. Right, so this is a perfect example of a multi-axis attack. You have legal, financial, cultural, as well as the actual terrorist organization who's doing the bombings. And this is a famous part of radical literature of how to attack, right? You always protect what they call the gadflies, right? A gadfly is a type of it's like a horsefly, or which basically attacks animals. They're very tenacious, and their bite is extremely painful. So they basically are protecting the people who are doing the actual damage, right? And this is in general more true of terrorist organizations on a broad scale. Like, you have 3 levels of different commitment, right? You have the people who are the actual guys doing the violence. You have the guys who are like not actually doing violence, but are like fairly strong supporters and actually doing non-violent activism and that sort of thing. And then you have the more tepid supporters who might be convinced to give money or provide vocal support for some of the causes that these people tend to espouse, right? So that's essentially what they're doing. They're setting up a broad network here. In the wake of the encirclement, the leadership and the San Francisco cadres scattered. After the encirclement, we had to do what was essential, which was fall back on support, recalls Ayers, who had moved to Los Angeles. We ran to a lot of friends and asked for help, but it kind of slowed things down, for sure. We had to devise other ways and other kinds of ID. It was like starting over. Again. Many cadres fled to new cities and new identities to await orders that, in some cases, didn't come for months. David Gilbert went to ground in Denver, while others fled to Seattle. Mark Rudd, now thoroughly alienated from the leadership, fled to active work together, resettling with his girlfriend in Santa Fe. Others simply melted away. Still others fell victim to the paranoia that gripped the underground after the San Francisco raid. Yeah, so again, this is another parallel and another similarity to the actual the dissident right sphere. The constantly reforging new identities is a lot like routinely starting new social media sock accounts, right? This is, every time you get, this is, I'm banned, it's over, I'm back, it's, we're so back, it's literally like that. Although I do find it fascinating that these cities that they're referring to, right, not just the usual ones like Los Angeles or New York or San Francisco, not just these coastal ones, but they also have Seattle, Denver, and Santa Fe, right? I think that's very fascinating because all of these areas that whether underground types have moved to are in blue states now. Like, it's very funny. I find that fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. One such situation involved a former Kent State student who had rented the apartment on Pine Street. And as several Weather alumni tell it, the student was experimenting with gay life, and the habits he developed in San Francisco worried many. He would pick up guys at Oh my god. He's literally picking up dudes at bathhouses. He would pick up guys at bathhouses and bring them back to the safe houses. You can't do that, not without being compromised, recalls Paul Bradley. After the encirclement, the student was transferred to New York, where his problems continued. None of us had dealt with gay issues at that point, recalls Fliegelman. He would go off and do stuff. Oh, I bet he would do stuff. And he could be compromised. So he ended up having to leave. Yeah, I bet. The encirclement obliged Robbie Roth's busy New York collective to scatter as well. Eleanor Stein sat on the floor of its apartment in Cobble Hill, Brooklyn, spread out a piece of butcher paper, and charted all the connections between the West Coast and East Coast IDs. There were enough, it was decided, that the New Yorkers needed to relocate. It took a solid week to scrub every surface of that place, erasing every fingerprint, recalls Jonah Raskin. It was an unbelievable headache. Well, at least they're thorough. The whereabouts of the West Coast leadership, Bernardine Dohrn, Bill Ayers, and Jeff Jones, after they left San Francisco in spring 1971, have remained a secret for 40 years. In his memoir, Fugitive Days, Bill Ayers portrays their life as nomadic, moving between working-class hideouts, including a perch above a goat shed on a commune, and later in the groundskeeper's quarters of a mansion near Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles, as well as a basement room in the monastery of Mundelein, which is apparently in Illinois, and a stone house on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. However complete the list may be, the one place Ayers doesn't mention is the actual home the leadership found shortly after the encirclement, which would serve as the group's informal West Coast headquarters for several years. It was not, as Ayers wanted his readers to believe, some decrepit flat in an out-of-the-way slum. In fact, it was a sunny bungalow just steps from the ocean in Hermosa Beach, an Orange County beach community thronged with surfers and hippies. Well, these guys do certainly seem to know how to hide in plain sight, don't they? It was really cozy. You could hear the surf, recalls Martin Doyle. It was on this little street on an alley, jammed in against similar places, with a postage stamp-sized patio. The rooms were decorated in tasteful hippie. Bernadine had Rococo tastes. A lot of pillows and nice patterned cloths on the furniture in rich colors and textures. I remember she used Madras bedspreads for curtains. The Bay Area, however, was far too important for Weather to abandon. From the moment they left, in fact, Dorn was determined to reestablish a presence there. It was a power center of the left, and you didn't want the FBI to beat you. You wanted to show them you couldn't be defeated, that you could come back hard and fast, recalls Doyle, who, in the absence of other San Francisco cadres, emerged as a key intermediary in Dorn's orbit. The first weatherman to return to the city was Paul Bradley, who was developing a lifelong love for the area. He managed to rent a secluded carriage house on Vallejo Street in the Russian Hill section. It was perfect, nestled in a garden behind an apartment building with a single entrance to the street. Bradley lived there for several years. Out-of-town visitors, including the leadership, were always welcome. A second flat was rented in the Sunset area. Once he was established, Dorn asked him to approach Doyle. Thin, with long, scraggly hair, Doyle had lingered on the edges of Weather for the previous year. Bradley had approached him months earlier and asked to use his telephone for calls and his home address as a mail drop. Wary but secretly thrilled, Doyle had agreed. At one point, aware that he was being considered for active membership, he had ridden with Bradley to the Point Reyes National Seashore, north of San Francisco, for a rendezvous with Dorn, who dazzled him. She was spellbinding, Doyle recalls, sexy, brilliant, and immensely articulate. And she had this boldness, on a higher level than I'd ever been exposed to. The power and the intellect, she just blew you away. Then, in the weeks after the encirclement, Bradley came to him once more. "Man, we're really desperate for cash," Bradley said, and Doyle handed over his last $1,500 from a fellowship. After that, Doyle's responsibilities grew. One day that spring, a weatherman drove him to a remote garage in the Sunset District, which to Doyle's surprise had not only Jeff Jones's beloved pickup truck, Susie Q, but all of Jones and Dorn's belongings, abandoned after the encirclement. After wiping the truck for fingerprints, it was later sold. The men loaded everything into a camper, after which Bradley arrived and told Doyle to drive. Without a clue about their destination, Doyle drove south, arriving later that day south of Los Angeles, where he drove into a warren of alleys alongside the ocean in Hermosa Beach. It was there that Doyle saw the leadership's new home and forged a relationship with Dorn. For weeks after the encirclement, Dorn remained leery of San Francisco, but Weather had many allies in the Bay Area, so she began slipping into the city on a regular basis. often meeting Doyle in parks and at restaurants. We would sit and talk for like 2 hours in Ghirardelli Square a lot and elsewhere. He remembers. She would say, "Go do this. Go talk to this guy and say this." We hit it off real well. I basically became her gopher. And, in time, her lover. Yeah, I remember she returned from the East at one point to LA, and with this other couple, we went to a Grateful Dead concert, Doyle recalls. We ended up in bed. We had a kind of summer fling. Well, this seems to be a consistent pattern from Dorn, right? She uses her sensuousness and her sexuality to, solidify political loyalties. Also, they went to a Grateful Dead concert. Like, how? These people basically, as a radical lifestyle, had a total, like, and they're living in a house on the oceanfront property. Like, they're not really sacrificing all that much, it seems to me. Dorn's sudden availability, it would appear, coincided with the breakup of her relationship with Jones. Ah, that explains that. So this guy is the sloppy seconds. This is Dorn's post relationship. What's it called when they have you have a chick who breaks up and then immediately gets a new boyfriend. What's that called? Her bounce back or something? I don't remember. Neither has ever spoken publicly about what happened. Some within the organization blamed Jones for the encirclement, leading to speculation that Dorn had soured on him as a result. The fact that she subsequently entered into a long-term relationship with Bill Ayers led still others to believe there had been a love triangle at work. Whatever happened, the dissolution of the Dorn-Jones union had a few obvious repercussions. It was a big deal, recalls Bald Bradley, who was close to Dorn. My memory is the three of them kept it pretty close to the vest at the last minute when an announcement was made. It actually went surprisingly smoothly. After the breakup, Jones decided to relocate to the East Coast. Eleanor Stein happened to be visiting from New York, and the two drove across the country. They eventually arrived at what would become Weather's ad hoc New York headquarters, a remote 4-bedroom rental house with a pond on an acre of land deep in the Catskill Mountains, a few hours' drive north of Manhattan. The New York cell had moved in after the encirclement. Ron Fliegelman and one or two others lived there with Stein and Jones for more than a year. Taking long walks, watching the morning mist rise over the Pipacton Reservoir, Jones began to relax, even after he saw his wanted poster at the post office in the nearby town, Delhi. He started a garden, planting cucumbers and tomatoes. He and Stein were opposites, a communist-raised New York intellectual and a California suburb type. But in those early days in the Catskills, they fell in love. Like Dorn and Ayers, they would eventually marry. 40 years later, both couples remain together. So this is a fascinating little anecdote that I want to point out here, because this is a very interesting pattern of miscegenation on the part of Eleanor Stein's type. I forget if I went through Jim Jones's. See if I can find his name here, like in the front part of the book. I don't think that his background is actually Jewish. I know Eleanor Stein's is. Let's see. Yeah, Jeff Jones. No, but he does have a Quaker connection. Okay. Right, so this is very interesting because, like, Bernadine Dorn is half Jewish. She's Mischling. And Bill Ayers is obviously Scottish. And then, see, there's this weird pattern of miscegenation where you have these, like, obvious, like, Jewish-connected people who are marrying, Gentiles in this movement. Very interesting indeed as a pattern. I'm not sure what to make of that now, honestly, but I think it's got to be significant that you find this in these radical circles. Anyway, Jeff Jones's tranquil new life in the mountains was in many ways a symbol of the changes the Weather Underground was undergoing. The New York Times began printing the Pentagon Papers that June. The anti-war movement was slowing noticeably. They had gone underground with the dreams of triggering a Castro-style revolution in America. It hadn't happened. Only the deluded still believed it would. By any measure, their grand vision of rallying young Americans to a bloody revolution had failed. They had succeeded only in surviving. At a bungalow in Hermosa Beach, at a secluded carriage house on San Francisco's Russian Hill, at a Dewey rental house in the Catskills, what remained of the Weathermen needed time to take stock. After the encirclement, things really slowed down, says Rick Ayers. I believe that's Ayers' brother, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, that's Bill Ayers' brother, who, of course, Rick Ayers is the guy who organized West Coast Logistics, according to the text. And it says, okay, it would begin at a time when things were much slower, more time between actions, more time to think. Everybody needed to chill out. Now, nowhere was the change in tone more evident than in the group's new approach to bombings. Until the encirclement, Weather had always taken the initiative. Afterward, almost all its bombings were staged in reaction to specific events. A case in point was the first action it carried out after the San Francisco raids. The twin California bombings described by Martin Doyle in Chapter 6. They came in retaliation for the August 21st killing at San Quentin State Prison of a charismatic inmate named George Jackson, whose best-selling memoir, Soledad Brother, had fueled a newfound interest in prison conditions in Bay Area radical circles. The planning was done at the new Sunset apartment. It was a typical San Francisco apartment, elongated windows, scruffy furniture, Doyle recalls. A lot of hanging out there, a lot of intense meetings, people coming and going. That's where Ron and people from New York would stay when they came out. That was kind of the center of gravity the whole summer. Right, so you can kind of see that after the initial impetus for radicalism, once they actually get caught, they really have to, they got pretty small, basically, as the chapter title notes. So you can kind of see, like, for patterns for our thing, right, the initial impetus is very high energy, and then it kind of slows off and the energy kind of dies down a little bit. And once you have control of the situation, basically, this is how I would characterize this, that the left's revolution by this point had already been thoroughly solidified, is you do things in response to things. No, I don't like this action of the government. No, I don't like this other thing. Right. So this is very interesting. The bomb Doyle and Paul Bradley placed above a second-floor ceiling tile in the Department of Corrections office in San Francisco's historic Ferry Building demolished a small psychiatric clinic. A second bomb wrecked a sixth-floor restroom at the department's headquarters in Sacramento. No one was injured in either explosion. The communique, mailed to the San Francisco Examiner, was a departure from previous weather missives. A lengthy diatribe denouncing the treatment of American blacks, and especially black prisoners. Black and brown people inside the jails are doing all they can. Must they fight alone even now? White people on the outside have a deep responsibility to enter the battle at every level. Each of us can turn our grief into righteous anger and our anger into action. 2 small bombs do not cool our rage. We view our actions as simply a first expression of our love and respect for George Jackson and the warriors of San Quentin. Ugh, man. These people never give up, do they? Weather's interest in prison conditions deepened 2 weeks later, on September 13th, when the killing of 29 inmates and 10 state personnel during a rebellion at New York's Attica prison sparked widespread calls for reform. The New York cell, comfortably ensconced in their Catskill Mountains hideaway, staged their first post-encirclement action 4 days later. Ron Fliegelman, as usual, built the bomb, which was smuggled into a 9th-floor washroom outside the offices of Russell G. Oswald, commissioner of the New York Department of Correctional Services in Albany. Early that evening, a warning was called into the Albany Times-Union. The building was quickly cleared, and at 7:30 the bomb detonated, destroying the washroom. No one was injured. Tonight, we attacked the head offices of the New York State Department of Corrections, the forthcoming communique read. We must continue to make the Rockefellers, Oswalds, Reagans, and Nixons pay for their crimes. We only wish we could do more to show the courageous prisoners at Attica, San Quentin, and the other 20th century slave ships that they are not alone in their fight for the right to live. The final Weather Underground bombing of 1971 came on October 15th, when the group's Proud Eagle affiliate detonated a small bomb above a ceiling panel in the 4th floor women's restroom at the Grover M. Herman building at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The early morning explosion slightly damaged an adjacent office used by the one-time White House aide William Bundy. A 2-page communique sent to the Boston Globe blamed Bundy's role in crafting the war in Vietnam. Cody Bassett says, reading Harassment Architecture, Maverick General, and The Fellowship of the Rings concurrently. Ah, yes. Yes, that is something I also do. When Weatherman did get around to bombing things, the preparation and execution remained fraught with risk. Long-haired young people lingered outside courthouses and police stations late at night. Lingering outside courthouses and police stations late at night tended to draw attention in the early 1970s. It occurred to Dorn and to others in the leadership that disguises alone wouldn't ensure their safety. Thus the question arose, what could they take along to reliably deflect a policeman's curiosity? One answer was children. And of course I have written in the margins here, Cheza. That's Cheza Boudin, the former San Francisco city councilman, if I'm not mistaken. No beat cop, they reasoned, would suspect a family with kids out for an evening stroll. It was a brilliant idea. The only problem was, no one in Weather had children. A handful of supporters did, however, and this was how one of Dorn's friends, the Chicago attorney Dennis Cunningham, saw his family drawn into clandestineness. Cunningham, as we have seen, had emerged as a key conduit for the money that paid the leadership's living expenses. He adored Dorn and considered her one of the most talented minds he had ever encountered. If anything, Cunningham's wife, Mona, a tall, thin actress in Chicago's Second City theater troupe, was even more dazzled. A budding revolutionary herself, Mona, had actually attended the Flint Wargasm, taking along Marvin Doyle, who happened to be a relative of her husband's. Mona was so smitten by Dorn, in fact, that when she gave birth to her 4th child in June 1970, she named her Bernardine. The Cunninghams, however, had been having marital troubles, and their work with the underground added a new strain to their disagreements. Then, in the fall of 1970, Dorn invited the couple to California. It was a relaxing trip. The Cunninghams accompanied Dorn and Jeff Jones on a tour of California campgrounds in an old camper. It was during this trip, Cunningham recalls, that Dorn floated the idea of the couple joining them underground. She said, maybe you should just fade out, disappear, and come out here. Maybe live down around Santa Rosa, Cunningham recalls. It made no sense to me. What could I do? I couldn't figure out what the fuck she was talking about. In Chicago, Cunningham had a bristling practice defending all manner of radicals. including the late Fred Hampton and many other black activists. He couldn't just leave. But Mona Cunningham seemed intrigued. Dorn was surprisingly candid, encouraging Mona to come alone. Dennis recalls, "She was like all of them, Mark read all of them. She just came out and said it. You're really going to stay in this fucking monogamy?" After a tense discussion, Dennis announced he was returning to Chicago. Mona stayed behind, Dennis says, to learn about things. I think she stayed a week or 10 days before she came back to Chicago. As that winter wore on, Mona talked often of going underground. Eventually, the following June, the Cunninghams separated. Which is how, in the summer of 1971, Mona Cunningham, now going by her maiden name, Mona Mellis. I'm going to do an early life check on this chick. Oh, shit. No Wikipedia profile, unfortunately. Dang it. Anyway, which is how in the summer of 1971, Mona Cunningham, now going by her maiden name, Mona Mellis, left Chicago and moved west. Initially into an Oregon commune, then into a flat in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury. She brought all 4 of her children, Delia, who turned 8 that year, her younger brother Joey, another daughter Miranda, and a baby Bernardine. Dorn welcomed Mona with open arms, continuing what would become a long friendship. The two often referred to themselves as sisters. At the same time, Mona began an extended affair with Bill Ayers. I mean, of course. She wasn't interested. It's always connected. The politics is always connected with the sex, isn't it? You know, with these people. It wasn't that she wanted to do radical stuff. It's because she just wanted to have sex with another dude. But of all the relationships renewed by the Mellis family's move to San Francisco, it was the one between Dorn and the 8-year-old Delia Mellis that would endure. Dorn was like a favorite aunt or an older sister, just very cool and very fun to be with. Remembers Delia, today a faculty member affiliated with Bard College in New York. I mean, every single one of these people has a position in academia. Every single one of them. The move into Dorn's orbit introduced Delia to a strange new world of intrigue she found thrilling. There were secret things, and I kept them secret, she recalls. We would go see Bernardine and Billy, and Mom would say, "Don't say anything about this at school. Don't tell your dad. Don't tell your grandparents." I knew what was happening, and what they were doing, and why. I knew the FBI was all around, and it was dangerous. I never told a soul. When Dorn was visiting from Hermosa Beach, Delia would join her in the Sunset area apartment, but before long she began accompanying her on outings, first around San Francisco, then to Hermosa Beach and other destinations she can only vaguely remember. In those early months, Mona would drop Delia off at the Golden Gate Park's Conservatory of Flowers, a Victorian-era greenhouse, where her mother showed her how to watch for police. Once they were sure they weren't followed, Mona would leave, and Delia would wander among the greenery until Dorn or Bill Ayers or Paul Bradley would mysteriously appear to take her away. In Hermosa Beach, Dorn and Ayers, now Molly and Mike, would take her shopping and to the movies. They insisted on calling Delia by her code name, Sunflower, which Delia secretly loathed. That's like the most hippie name of hippie names. "Oh, excuse me, this is our daughter Sunflower." It's like, oh my god. This is so ridiculous. I went to LA a bunch of times, Delia recalls. I would play while they had meetings. There was a lot of time and cars. Bernardine and Billy always had cool cars, 50s cars. We would go to movies, old films, Chaplin films. Later I started going on trips into the countryside to other cities, trips on airplanes, on trains, cross-country, once or twice to upstate New York, where I think I stayed when Jeff Jones moved there. I knew they loved spending time with us, my siblings included, but I also knew we were good cover. The two things went together. I knew Mom was really into that we were helping. Did we scout our bombing targets? Yeah, I think so. I never actually saw anything explode, but it was always discussed. We had a great action. We're just going to be discussing an action. In time, Delia came to know almost all of the remaining Weathermen, though their ever-changing code names perplexed her. I totally loved Kathy Wilkerson. Kathy was Susie. Paul Bradley introduced me to comic books. He was Jack. Robbie Roth was Jimmy. Rick Ayers was Skip. I didn't like it when Bernadine changed from Molly to Rose and Billy went from Mike to Joe. It was confusing. The second Mellis daughter, Miranda, who was 3 when the family moved to San Francisco, fell into Wilkerson's orbit. I was not allowed to go near Delia because she was Bernadine's, Wilkerson recalls. So Miranda and we would hitchhike to Santa Cruz and walk on the beach all day. She remembers none of it. It had nothing to do with actions. Even the baby, Bernadine, everyone called her by her nickname, Redbird, was used. I used to take the baby, little Bernadine, down to Hermosa Beach and leave her with big Bernadine all the time, recalls Marvin Doyle. It was cover, sure, but it was also a respite for Mona. Paul Bradley recalls a trip in which he was obliged to ferry the baby back north on a commercial flight. It took time for Dennis Cunningham, who remained in Chicago, to realize what had happened. Dorn had been interested in me going underground, he says, but they definitely wanted Mona out there, because I think what they wanted most was my kids to use as beards. I know what Mona did. I know how many of these trips Delia went on with Bernadine. She and the other kids went on actions. Did it upset me? Well, I was indifferent at first, then a little fearful, sure. As the months stretched into years, all 4 of Mona Mellis's children grew accustomed to traveling with the Weathermen. Wilkerson drove cross-country with Delia and Miranda at least once. The children were useful ornaments, but other factors were at work. Several of the Weather women were approaching 30, and a few, like Dorn and Wilkerson, were struggling with the issue of motherhood. Says Wilkerson of her time with Miranda, "It was all about my biological clock. I had always been a kid person, and then I had given up kids for the revolution." Delia believes she and her siblings served not only as cover but as surrogate children until these women could become mothers themselves. Bernadine once told me we were the reason she decided to become a mother, Delia remembers. Until then, she had been wrapped up in this idea that she couldn't and still remain a feminist. Yeah, I have it written in my notes in the margins here that this is one reason why they need IVF and surrogacy. And the reason for that is because it allows them to keep women, especially radical women, in the fight for longer, right? The years, remember all of these people got, PhDs. They're all college professors. They all have graduate degrees, etc. So the fact that surrogacy is an issue because you're doing radical work, right? And you're doing radical work in your late 20s or early 20s, maybe mid to late 20s, early 30s. Once you get out of this lifestyle and you go back to academia, that's also another substantial time commitment. So it just works out that you're not going to be able to do all of these things and also be a mother. And so that's probably why they push for IVF. That's why they push so hard for surrogacy, because it allows them to keep the individual women who are in this thing in radical politics. And it like every single thing that they do is to lessen the material sacrifice of their membership, right? That's every single decision that Dorn makes here is actually, it's not that brilliant. It's actually quite simple when you really think about it. What is she doing here with these children? Well, the children serve a very valuable goal of giving them like cover. Obviously, that's the stated purpose. The revealed purpose is she actually has a lot of women who are very, very critical to this movement, in key roles, like Kathy Wilkerson, who's the West Coast bomb maker, and they're all struggling because they're in their early to mid 30s, or they're approaching 30, and now the question of children is like definitively on the table. So you have to answer this question. And it gives you, with a surrogate child, it gives you a bit of time to get, as they say, to put on the training wheels, as it were. Dennis Cunningham, it turned out, wasn't the only person keeping tabs on what Mona Melis was up to in San Francisco. At least one of his friends was an FBI informer, and it didn't take long before Mona drew the Bureau's scrutiny. We got word that Mona was coming out to do her thing with Bernadine, a retired Bay Area FBI agent named William Reagan recalls. She had been on our radar, but it wasn't until she came out here that things got serious. Willie Reagan wasn't just any FBI man. He was one of the first agents in the Bureau's history to work exclusively undercover. After transferring from Florida, Reagan had been among the first San Francisco agents to begin wearing long hair and hippie attire in 1969. Most used this disguise only to infiltrate public meetings and demonstrations. Heavily bearded, a dead ringer for the rock singer David Crosby, Reagan had tracked weather fugitives in vain since the group's earliest days, hanging out with Abbie Hoffman and other Yippie leaders in hopes of sifting them out. He had been one of the beards on Market Street the day of the encirclement. You can see that by this point, once the feds are onto you, it becomes very these little connections, right? You have the actual FBI guy, like literally surveilling these people. Interesting. I also want to talk about briefly, now that because I forgot to mention it in the earlier paragraphs, the experience of these young children in this radical movement at an early age. And I want to connect this to transsexualism. Not just are you inundated with left-wing politics, and especially radical politics, and the theory is everything, this Hegelian usage of the wall of text leftist meme, right? It's also very interesting because their early experiences are always like the ever-changing reality, right? This is an experience that, your identity is immutable, isn't it? Right? The experience of early childbirth, these people would all have been like 5 or 6 at most at the time, maybe earlier. And growing up in this environment where everybody is changing their name and it's all very confusing to a young child, I can easily imagine that for both of those reasons, these people probably have a higher incidence rate of transsexualism, and they probably transition more often. And I wonder if that's the case, if this is one of these early childhood formative experiences where you don't really know what somebody's true identity is. They're constantly changing their name. They're constantly changing their hair color and putting beards on and growing facial hair, shaving the facial hair, doing all of these kinds of things, changing their clothes, right? So this early formative experience is that identity is immutable, and of course, as I've mentioned before, the radical weather underground movement always uses as its symbol a rainbow, of course, right? So, just something to think about. Reagan thought Mona Mellis was the best lead the FBI had gleaned in its 18 frustrating months hunting the weather leadership. When she and her children rented the apartment in Haight-Ashbury, Reagan moved into the same building. Riffing on his Florida background, he posed as Bill Raymond, a fugitive Gulf Coast gambler now working as an accountant for a group of marijuana farmers. Mona was sharp, Reagan recalls. I remember the first time I met her, walking up the apartment stairs, probably December 71. She said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm your new neighbor." She goes, "How did you get this apartment? I've had friends who wanted to move into this building and they couldn't get in." I gave her this long explanation about how I knew some people in the Haight-Ashbury, and that seemed to satisfy her. Yeah, that was probably a bullshit answer. Both the FBI and the San Francisco police kept Mona's building under around-the-clock surveillance. They followed most of her visitors, not that it mattered. We didn't have anything close to modern surveillance procedures, Reagan says with a sigh. Half the time, we had no idea who we were following. They were really good at losing our guys. SFPD detectives, meanwhile, zealously searched the Mellis family's trash. Oh God, worst trash you've ever smelled, recalls one retired detective. Her kids were vegetarians, and those diapers, oh Jesus. They're literally forcing their children to be like vegan. That's funny. Oh man. As the weeks ticked by, Reagan made a habit of encountering Mona in the hallways. They became friendly. Mona was in the process of coming out as a lesbian. Oh, really? Oh, sure. And Reagan began accompanying her to a lesbian bar, Maud's, where they played pool. Why am I not surprised? Maud just sounds like such a bull-dyke name. It's the most stereotypical bull-dyke lesbian name I think I've ever heard. That winter, in fact, Reagan grew close enough to Mona that she asked him to babysit her children, the very same children who were hanging out with the weather leadership. But neither the children nor Mona ever said a meaningful word about Bernardine Dorn or the Weather Underground. The FBI didn't have a clue about Delia's visits with Dorn. In fact, Reagan didn't learn of Dorn's relationship with the Mellis children until he was interviewed for this book. At only one point during the 6 or 7 months he lived in their building, he says, did he sense the weatherman's presence. It came in the spring of 1972, when he agreed to drive Mona to a music festival in Colorado. At the last moment, she canceled, then asked Reagan if he would take one of her girlfriends instead. The trip never happened, but Reagan did catch one tantalizing glimpse of the girlfriend when Mona briefly opened her apartment door. The young woman, whoever she was wearing a bright red wig, and for a fleeting moment, Reagan thought it was Dorn. He never met her, or saw her again, and shortly afterward transferred to British Columbia, where he spent the next 2 years tracking sightings of weather fugitives. I don't know whether that was Bernardine or not, he says. It haunts me to this day. North of the city, in Marin County, another FBI agent, Bud Watkins, had his own chances to pursue the weather leadership. Michael Kennedy's law partner, Joe Rhine, had a home on a remote hillside near Point Reyes, and one of his neighbors told a story of encountering Rhine with a woman while out walking. The woman repeatedly turned her face away from the neighbor's gaze, making him suspicious. And during a subsequent visit to the post office, the neighbor spied Dorn's wanted poster. He was certain the woman he had seen was Dorn, but the FBI, despite another long surveillance, was never able to confirm it. Watkins felt he got much closer to capturing Kathy Boudin. The Bureau had flagged her fake driver's license, and when the license was entered into a state database following a speeding violation in Marin, Watkins and another agent had an all-points bulletin issued on the car. It was found a few days later in San Anselmo, parked near the home of an attorney with well-known radical sympathies. Surveillance on the car, however, indicated that it had been abandoned. Boudin was never found. By the beginning of 1972, Weather's energies were ebbing. They were down to 15 or so active members, and almost all were questioning their reason for being. There were long periods when not much got done, remembers Ron Fliegelman. We met with people to raise money, we talked about politics, you read, you talked. It was never boring, it was pleasant. Weather's leadership, especially Dorn, spent much of 1972 traveling the country in an effort to rebuild the political and intellectual alliances it had so cavalierly burned after destroying SDS. By mid-1971, we realized we had pissed too many people off, says Marvin Doyle. It was time to rebuild those bridges, and Bernadine was really good at that. She was completely sincere. For most of America, however, Weather simply disappeared. During all of 1972, in fact, it mounted only one action, though its target was significant: the Pentagon. This lone bombing can be understood in the context of input the leadership was receiving from other radical groups, who felt that protest bombings no longer had much purpose. For Weather to give up bombings altogether, however, would be to disavow everything it had achieved to that point. Dorn and Ayres, at least, agreed on a new tack: fewer bombings, bigger targets. Well, I mean, this is interesting because it allows you to do much more planning, and it also means that you have far more time in between actions to prepare, and you have to remember these people also have children now in their midst, so that is another requirement. So I wonder if this is just, bending with conditions on the ground and realizing, oh, well, you take the easiest course of action, right? You act like water, basically. Always take the easiest path. A description of the Pentagon bombing is included in Bill Ayres' Fugitive Days, and while he uses pseudonyms, it seems clear that members of the New York cell were responsible. The key participant, Aaron, appears to be a thinly disguised Ron Fliegelman. It's interesting that he gives a stereotypically biblical name to Fliegelman as a pseudonym. Fliegelman says he does not remember the incident. Aaron, Ayres writes, was the backbone of the group, entirely committed and trustworthy, hardworking and dependable, a guy we all believed could easily survive in the Australian outback or the Siberian wilderness for weeks with nothing but a pocket knife. The model middle cadre. Just pretty much exactly a description of Ron Fliegelman. Remember, Ron Fliegelman is the bomb maker for the eastern portion of the United States, for the New York cell at least. And of course, he, in this book, claimed to have done more than that. He claimed to basically done everything that Kathy Wilkerson has claimed to do. We'll see. The Pentagon was the second of Weather's 3 dream targets, the others being the Capitol, bombed a year earlier, and the White House, which they had cased by mingling with tours. Remember that at this time, you could actually still get tours of the White House, so it's not inconceivable that these people would have gone on tours of government buildings. Aaron was one of 3 weathermen who studied the Pentagon off and on for months. The others, a woman Ayres calls Anna, and a man he calls Zeke, may well have been Robbie Roth and any one of several female weathermen. They deposited their dynamite in a rented storage locker and, in keeping with tradition, took a cheap apartment they paid for by the week. Anna was their scout, walking into the Pentagon most mornings amid the crowds of incoming office workers. She wore a dark wig and thick glasses, dressed in a suit and carrying a briefcase, and covered her fingertips in clear nail polish, the better to obscure any fingerprints she left behind. In the days before the military tightened its security procedures, she was able to prowl the long miles of hallways unchallenged, usually leaving by 11 a.m. Back at the apartment, she drew elaborate maps from memory. "I can do it," Ayres writes. "I can do it," she said finally, pulling out her sketches and maps. Here, she pointed to an isolated hallway in the basement of the Air Force section. "I've been here 4 times, never seen another person, and there's a woman's room halfway down right here. She made an X on the map. There's a drain on the floor, narrow, but big enough, I think, she says. One more visit was planned in order to unscrew the cover and take the dimensions of the space. Anna was in the next day at 9 a.m. and was in the women's room and the stall by 9:10 a.m. She locked the door, hung up her jacket, and pulled plastic gloves, a screwdriver, and a tape measure from her briefcase. The grated cover was gunky, but easy to pop off once the screws were out, and there was a comfortable 4-inch diameter that ran down for over a foot. Anna replaced the drain cover, wiped the area down, and was back at the apartment by 10 a.m. Right? These people are pushing on open doors. Erin had the bomb ready when she returned. A foot-long packet of dynamite with fishing line, and a hook tied to one end so that it could be lowered into the drain. The final decision to move forward was made only after calls with Dorn and Ayers. Afterward, Erin slid the bomb beneath the papers in Anna's briefcase, and she returned to the Pentagon to place it in the drain. While Anna and Zeke left town, Erin spent the rest of the afternoon wiping down the apartment, cleaning the storage locker, and paying their remaining bills. He called in the first warning to the Washington Post, making just one slip-up. He said a bomb would detonate on the 8th floor, but the Pentagon has only 5. At 11:30, Erin phoned a second warning to the Pentagon's emergency line. The bomb went off just before 1 a.m., right on schedule, demolishing the 4th floor restroom and sending thousands of gallons of water cascading onto a shopping concourse below. Among the weathermen, this was a major strategic victory, a strike inside the heart of America's war machine, by far the most audacious bombing in the group's short history. However, 1972 was not 1970. And in the ensuing days, the tenor of the mainstream press coverage was far more scathing than after bombings just 2 years before. In an especially stinging comment, the New York Times editorialized, "The bomb explosion at the Pentagon represents a return to the mindless display of violence as a means of registering dissent from the violence of war. The ultra-radicals who boast of responsibility for this pointless act stand totally discredited by the overwhelming mass of the student generation whom they once hoped to enlist in their anarchist ranks. It is important to recognize the culprits for what they are, not idealistic activists, but vandals posing as revolutionaries." Interesting that the New York Times is taking such a scathing line here. By 1972, the lassitude that pervaded the weather underground had spread to its government pursuers. The roving prosecutor, Guy Goodwin, was still convening grand juries, but not one had led to a significant arrest, much less a conviction. The FBI's feckless work, meanwhile, reached a turning point that spring. For 2 solid years, agents across the country had engaged in a variety of illegal activities designed to track down Weather's leadership. Illegal wiretapping, mail opening, and dozens of break-ins, much of it targeting the group's families, friends, and supporters. Anyone, in short, who might have the first idea where they were hiding. But by May 1972, when J. Edgar Hoover died at the age of 77, the Bureau had precisely one arrest to show for the risks it had taken. That of Judy Clark outside a Manhattan theater, a matter of sheer luck. Conventional methods had gotten them nowhere. Privately, many officers in the busiest weatherman squad, New York's Squad 47, thought weather no longer warranted the resources the Bureau was devoting to it. Among the nicknames agents pinned on the group was the Terrible Toilet Bombers. They even penned a bit of doggerel. "Weatherman, weatherman, what do you do? Blow up a toilet every year or 2. When the squad's supervisors, John Kearney, retired that June, his men gathered to present him with a gift. "We haven't managed to actually capture any of the weather leadership," an agent announced, "but we have come awfully close." And with a flourish, he produced a clear plastic evidence envelope and presented it to Kearney, who grinned when he saw its contents. A pair of Bernardine Dorn's sisters, Jennifer's panties. So basically, they just raided her panty closet. That's funny. Kearney's replacement was a veteran agent named Horace Beckwith, who had been working radical cases, including the Sam Melville bombings, since 1966. Beckwith was deeply frustrated by the Bureau's inability to make arrests. In an attempt to reinvigorate the investigations, senior agents from around the country gathered in Quantico, Virginia that June. At such gatherings, agents typically referred to ongoing practices of questionable legality, the wiretaps, the break-ins, by euphemisms. That day, however, a Detroit agent rose during the afternoon session and exasperatedly blurted out, "We're doing bag jobs, wires, and opening mail. What else can we do?" The outburst rattled at least one headquarters official, Edward Miller, who headed the Internal Intelligence Division. He approached a group of senior agents and asked, "Do you think I should be hearing all this?" Indeed, there seemed to be widespread confusion at the top levels of the Bureau as to what methods had been approved and who had approved them. Hoover was dead. His right-hand man, Bill Sullivan, had resigned. No one left in their wake seemed entirely sure what was legal and what wasn't. Indeed, the legality of many of the FBI's tactics was already being debated in two major court cases, both of which climaxed that June. The first occurred in Detroit, where 2 years earlier, most of the Weatherman leadership had been indicted in a federal court. One of their attorneys, a young New York firebrand named Gerald Lefcourt, repeatedly told the presiding judge, Damon J. Keith, that his clients' families had been the subject of months of illegal burglaries, wiretaps, and espionage techniques. The press, for the most part, ignored his claims, but Keith, in a startling decision issued June 5, 1972, ordered the government to disclose whether it had actually used burglaries, sabotage, or electronic surveillance methods in its investigations. 2 weeks later, on June 19th, the Supreme Court ruled in an unrelated case that warrantless wiretapping was in fact illegal. That same day, the U.S. Attorney General, Richard Kleindienst, issued a written directive ordering the FBI to immediately stop any and all wiretaps and burglaries that hadn't been authorized by a court. 40 years later, Don Strickland insists that no such order was relayed to the agents in Squad 47. "Nobody told us about it. I can tell you that. No one," he says. "We just kept doing what we'd been doing." Now, this is a perfect example of the deep state, right? This is a perfect example of higher-ups in the organizations who order something, they retire, they resign, they're out of the organization, new orders come down but aren't disseminated to the people who are actually supposed to be doing this work. And what do you think is going to be the consequence, right? "Oh, we just so happened to not tell you about it," right? "Oh, sure. It was just all emergent behavior, bureaucratic incompetence." Yeah, right. Questions about wiretaps and black bag jobs lingered all that summer in the chaos that pervaded FBI headquarters after Hoover's death. A new director, L. Patrick Gray, was named. But for months, no one seemed to have a clear sense of how aggressively he wanted to pursue the Weather Underground, which had detonated exactly one bomb in the previous 9 months. Finally, at a meeting of supervisors on August 29th, Ed Miller pointedly asked Gray whether black bag jobs would still be allowed. According to Miller, Gray said they would. At the subsequent meeting, Miller recalled. Gray stood up and he did tell them. He said he had decided to approve surreptitious entries, and this is a direct quote, "but I want you to make damn sure that none of these are done without prior Bureau authorization." Afterward, Miller telephoned one of his aides, Robert Shackelford, to say break-ins would be resumed. "That's good," Shackelford said, "because they're going on anyway." I mean, this is just the managerial non-ruling elite just doing whatever the hell they want, basically. Later that fall, reacting to the terrorist attacks at the Olympic Games in Munich, Richard Nixon issued a secret presidential directive calling for an all-out counterterrorism campaign. In Gray's mind, at least, this included actions against the Weather Underground. He told his number 2 man, Mark Felt, that he wanted the Weathermen hunted to exhaustion. Newly emboldened, Squad 47 renewed its illegal activities with a vengeance, initiating black bag jobs against the friends and families of 26 weather fugitives. It was all very secret and all very clearly now illegal. That October, in fact, the Justice Department unceremoniously dropped its case against the leadership in Detroit rather than disclose what the FBI was doing. To the Bureau's lasting regret, their activities would not remain secret for long. And with that, that is the end of chapter 11. I am going to take a quick break and grab some more coffee. So I'll take a couple minutes here. So just everybody chill out, and I will be back in just one moment. All right, we are back. I am refreshed with my coffee mug, and we can continue. All right, so we are moving on to Blood in the Streets of Babylon, the Black Liberation Army, 1973. And it begins with a poem by Joanne Chesimard, also known as Assata Shakur. It goes like this. I understand I am slightly out of fashion. The in crowd wants no part of me. Someone said that I am too 60s black. Someone else told me I had failed to mellow. The year 1973 was pivotal in post-war U.S. history. The year the Vietnam War was effectively lost, the Watergate scandal unraveled, the 60s era finally ended, and the wave of student uprisings and radicalism, one author notes, ran its course. The movement was dead. Abbie Hoffman, arrested on drug charges, went underground, writing a travel column for Crawdaddy magazine about his clandestine life. H. Rap Brown was in prison. Huey Newton fled to Cuba. Timothy Leary was arrested in Afghanistan and returned to give grand jury testimony against the Weather Underground. Why would he be in Afghanistan in the 70s, I wonder? Probably something to do with the later Soviet invasion, I would imagine. The previous autumn, the government of Algeria had finally thrown the Panthers out of their beloved embassy. Washing up in Paris, Eldridge Cleaver glumly told reporters that the revolution was over. He had lost. A new conservative mood was afoot, a reaction to 60s excesses, especially the wave of drugs, whose abuses and attendant violence had turned swaths of cities from San Francisco to New York into what the press liked to call war zones. Crime soared. The harsh Rockefeller drug laws passed in New York. The White House called for the death penalty. Nothing worked. It was, the author Andreas Killen notes, a genuine low point in American history. Nowhere was the clash between revolutionary diehards and a public newly incensed at drugs and violence more vividly on display than in the bloody final months of the Black Liberation Army. The BLA's last chapter began in the darkness before dawn on October 23, 1972. Lower Manhattan was quiet that morning, but deep inside the Manhattan House of Detention, the granite fortress known as the Tombs, 7 men were busy at work, with hacksaw blades. One was Anthony Kimu White, a 24-year-old BLA recruit. White had been in jail since taking part in the Harlem shootout that helped give birth to the BLA, the Plate Stewart incident in April 1971. After a head count at 6:15 a.m., the 7 men began sawing through 4 steel bars in their 4th-floor cell area. Once finished, they crawled across a 30-foot gangplank spanning an unused area of the jail that had been damaged in a 1970 rebellion. At the end of the gangplank, the men crawled up a 16-foot wall to a tiny window where they sawed through another set of steel bars. Squeezing through, they dropped a bedsheet ladder to a parking lot 40 feet below. A guard spotted them at 6:25 a.m., just as the last inmate leapt to the pavement and dashed into the gathering dawn. It was the first escape from the Tombs since it opened in 1941. And there's this footnote here that says, authorities later arrested 2 of the men's girlfriends and accused them of smuggling in hacksaw blades. Well, yes, of course, they had outside help, clearly. And though no one knew it, it would reinvigorate what remained of the Black Liberation Army in New York. Hello, Corbin. Good to see you, my friend. Kimu White wasted little time reuniting with his comrades in the New York BLA cell, one of only 2 cells still at large. The other was a group of West Coast exiles robbing banks in the New Orleans area. The New York cell was down to 15 or so desperate members, hunted, scattered, constantly on the move among squalid apartments in Harlem, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. The wild-eyed Twyman Myers was one, along with his pals Avon White and Fred Hilton, who had rejoined the BLA after serving brief terms in North Carolina jails after the November 1971 shooting of a sheriff's deputy. To the extent that these last survivors had any true leadership, it had fallen to the unlikeliest field marshal in the annals of black revolutionaries, 25-year-old Joanne Chesimard, who was poised to become the most wanted female in New York history. Chesimard went by many names. Her family knew her as Joey. In underground circles, where she would become an icon, she would be known as Assata Shakur. She had grown up in Queens with a troubled mother, but she was smart and pretty. Small and quiet, she had been a student at City College before she began running with the Panthers. She attended her share of protests, but otherwise little is known of her Panther career until an incident in March 1971, during the violence of the Panther split, when she was shot in the stomach during some kind of robbery at a Midtown Manhattan hotel, probably during an early BLA drug ripoff. She had been with Dhoruba Moore at 757 Beck Street, where she had disguised herself as a medic, and later with the BLA contingent in Atlanta. She was little known to the public during her years underground, but her notoriety skyrocketed once her career came to an end. It was then that the New York Daily News dubbed her Sister Love. It was then that the NYPD began referring to her as the heart and soul of the BLA. Whatever you called her, no one could deny she became a defining symbol of the underground era, where Bernardine Dohrn's name sometimes drew snickers from the most hardcore radicals. Chesimard would be viewed in the underground as perhaps the purest expression of revolutionary ardor, a ferocious, machine gun-toting, grenade-tossing, spitting mad Bonnie Parker for the 1970s, an archetype for a series of badass heroines heralded in Foxy Brown, Get Christy Love, and other blaxploitation films of the day. It was a powerful image. In time, Chesimard's visage would hang alongside those of Che Guevara and Malcolm X on the walls of scores of revolutionary venues. But while she was an angry young woman who almost certainly robbed banks and conspired in attacks on policemen, Chesimard left many more questions than answers in her wake. 40 years ago, the NYPD cast her as the BLA's last and greatest leader, blaming her for scores of crimes. There proved precious little evidence to back up these assertions, however, and today the handful of detectives still investigating the old BLA cases question almost all of these claims. Chesimard, rasps one New York investigator, is no fucking saint, but she was the heart and soul of the BLA. But was she the heart and soul of the BLA? Hell no. The guys back then demonized her because, unlike the others, she was educated. She was young and pretty. I can point to at least two other women in the BLA who were more important than Joanne Chesimard's ever was. We created that myth. The cops did. Adds a longtime BLA attorney, Robert Boyle, Assata was never this massively important figure the police portrayed her as. She was important. But the police made up this mythic image of a super black woman with the afro and the machine gun. She was never that. So this is an interesting point about the mythologies of containment and the system using containment by creating myths that are adopted by the radicals themselves. Very interesting. Divining the truth about Chesimard is not easy. During the 1970s, few journalists took the trouble to learn her story. What little they wrote came from police, whose theories proved unsupportable. Since then, she has been the subject of two books, an autobiography and a memoir written by her aunt, who was also her attorney. Both are notable for dwelling solely on her early and later life, leaving a gaping hole where one expects to find details of her career with the BLA. What is known is that in 1972, in the months after the Foster Lowry murders, Chesimard and the other BLA survivors limped back from St. Louis and Cleveland and Miami to the only city they knew, New York, and attempted to regroup. No coherent story of their lives that year has ever emerged. Only allegations of various outer borough armed robberies that eventually led to trials and typically not guilty verdicts. When it was finally over, the FBI and the NYPD would take some bare-bones statements from captured BLA members, but the few documents that survive give little sense of the desperate lives they must have led. Typical was the statement given by BLA member Ronald Anderson, a veteran of the Atlanta training camp. Anderson was one of the 3 BLA men who escaped from an Atlanta jail in November 1971 and spent the following weeks picking tomatoes in Florida. According to his statement, the trio finally raised enough cash for the long bus trip back to New York in January 1972. They hid in a relative's home in the Bronx for a month, living on money from one of their mothers. After that, they split up. Lumumba Shakur found an apartment for Anderson and John Thomas's one-time number 2, Andrew Jackson, on Dean Street in Brooklyn, where they lived with 2 Panther women who supported them by working as prostitutes in a Manhattan massage parlor. That spring, Anderson said, they finally met with Joanne Chesimard in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. She said she was leading a bank robbery gang with Twyman Myers and 2 other BLA soldiers and offered them a place in it. Anderson insists that he declined. Right, so here's again another pattern that obviously Vice funds radical activism. And it doesn't matter what kind of Vice. The overlap between radical terrorist groups or radical activist groups and organized crime simply cannot be denied. There are times and places when there's a Venn diagram between these two, and in many cases they probably overlap in their broad, general political agreement on certain issues. And when those interests are in alignment, they're going to work together. By the beginning of 1973, both the FBI and NYPD investigations of the BLA were languishing. In the 10 months since the shootout in St. Louis, precisely 2 BLA members had been captured. When an NYPD lieutenant named James Motherway arrived at his new assignment in the Major Case Squad's 13th Division, he found morale among the detectives low. No fewer than 8 groups were hunting the BLA at that point, including detective squads in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx, plus district attorneys in Brooklyn and Queens, apparently without talking with one another, much less the FBI. The NYPD was further hamstrung by 2 bugaboos of mid-1970s policing: the department's newfound sensitivities about race, and a lengthy corruption inquiry. A snapshot of the problem is offered in Motherway's unpublished memoir. So what's the problem? He recalls asking the assembled BLA investigators one morning in early 1973. No one responded. At first, no one wanted to be seen criticizing the department. The kiss of death, in Motherway's words. Maybe these pussies are afraid to talk, but I'm not. A bellicose detective named Joe Tidmarsh finally piped up. You want to know what's wrong? I'll tell you. The bosses won't turn us loose. We have a dozen leads they won't let us follow. Did you know we aren't allowed to go into Harlem after dark? No, Motherway said, skeptical. I didn't. Yeah, Tidmarsh went on. The deputy chief of detectives is afraid we'll cause a riot or shoot someone. It might ruin his chance for promotion. Another detective chimed in. Did you know we have a tap on Twyman Myers' mother's phone? Last week, we hear her telling her niece that she was going to meet baby. That's Twyman. Here she's going to meet the guy we know has killed a half dozen cops, and we couldn't tail her because it was nighttime in Harlem. Motherway left the meeting shaken. By coincidence, a few days later, the new chief of detectives, Lois Cottle, sent an inspector to find out why the BLA cases were stalled. Motherway was the last of the squad's lieutenants to be interviewed. Certain he was risking his career, he decided to relay the detectives' complaints. 3 days later, the deputy chief was replaced. The squad now reported directly to Cottle. Morale rose. Detectives were allowed into Harlem at night. Suddenly, they began aggressively pursuing a host of new leads. So interesting that when you change over personnel, especially in the leadership spot, that you start getting results. It's fascinating how that works. One involved 2 BLA members, Woody Green and Kimu White, the Tombs escapee. One detective learned that Green's wedding anniversary was January 23rd. Certain Green would see his wife. He asked for surveillance. Motherway approved it. That evening, detectives followed Green's wife to the Big T Lounge in Bushwick, Brooklyn. Sipping coffee in unmarked cars outside, they spotted Green walking into the bar at midnight. 2 detectives, Cleve Bethia and Philip Hogan, were sent in to confirm the identification. As they entered, they made eye contact with Green, who was standing at the bar alongside White and a dozen patrons. Suddenly, both Green and White drew pistols and opened fire. Hit by bullets in the left arm and leg, Bethia fell to the floor and passed out. Hogan, struck in the shoulder, rolled through the lounge's door onto the sidewalk. 9 detectives leaped from their cars, unsheathed pistols, and laid shotguns across the hoods of parked cars. Inside, the bar went quiet. The patrons flattened themselves on the floor. Within minutes, more than a dozen patrol cars began squealing to stops all around. When 2 detectives attempted to peer through the lounge's window, gunfire erupted from within, sending them scurrying for cover. Up and down the street, cops returned fire. Their bullets blasted the Big T Lounge to shreds, smashing windows and riddling the walls behind the bar. When everything finally went quiet, a detective crawled through the front door. He found White and Green dead on the floor. Miraculously, none of the other patrons were injured. Yeah, I bet they all took cover pretty early on in this gunfight. The only people who were standing up or shooting back are the crooks. To the press, it was just another BLA shootout. The Daily News carried the story on page 8, while the Times chose page 48. It's just another incident of, inner city violence. I mean, what's there to report on? To Joanne Chesimard and the remaining members of the BLA, however, it was as if the NYPD had violated a months-long ceasefire. Months later, a rare glimpse of the group's inner workings at the time would be provided by a captured BLA soldier, Avon White. According to White, Chesimard convened a strategy meeting the night after the shootout in a ratty safe house apartment in the Bronx. She argued for immediate retaliation. The others, a soldier named Melvin Carney, Zaid Shakur, Freddie Hilton, agreed. That same night, they stole a car in Brooklyn. Guns they had. The next evening, Thursday, January 25th, a frigid north wind was blowing as 2 officers, Officers Carlo and Vincent Imperato, climbed into their radio car at the East New York Avenue station in Brooklyn. It was a routine patrol, at least until 7:45, when Carlo, who was driving, stopped at a red light on Newport Street. Glancing to his left, Carlo was startled to see a black man in a raincoat step out of a parked car and aim an automatic rifle directly at him. It was a BLA man, Melvin Carney. "Duck!" Carlo yelled. Bullets shattered the driver's side window. One struck Carlo in the left shoulder, and flying glass gashed his brother's arm. Vincent drew his revolver and squeezed off 2 shots as Carlo mashed the accelerator and the patrol car surged forward, barreling through the intersection. Behind them, Carney kept firing. Police would find 23 bullet casings scattered on the pavement. The brothers drove themselves to Brookdale Hospital, where they were treated and released. There's a footnote here. According to Avon White, gunmen that night were Carney, Zaid Shakur, and Fred Hilton. Only Carney, armed with a Browning automatic, appears to have fired. Shakur and Hilton remained in the parked car. The shooting of the Imperato brothers led to a change in NYPD policy that remains in place to this day. Relatives can no longer ride in the same squad car. Yeah, I imagine how much security policy was basically determined by the radical activism of the 60s and 70s. Kopp brothers shot in Beekman ambush, screamed the Daily News headline the next day. The police commissioner, Patrick Murphy, chose his words carefully. We are very disturbed at this time because this was a deliberate attack without provocation. I'm very troubled, upset, and angry about this trend of violence shown against the police. This violence must cease. We ask the public to condemn this behavior. Everyone assumed it was the BLA. After a year in the shadows, the shooting thrust the group back onto the front pages. As it happened, the Imperato shootings came just days after a series of attacks in New Orleans in which a black radical named Mark Essex shot 19 people, killing 9, including 5 police officers. Some believed that Essex was a member of the BLA. Suddenly, the dormant debate about the BLA's existence reignited. In a lengthy article, the New York Times asked the central question: are there really organized cells of blacks dedicated to the ambush of urban patrolmen? Or, if nothing that extensive, are there a handful of guerrilla assassins moving from city to city and getting help from friends along the way? Talk of conspiracy has become virtually a reflex response to such incidents in the last few years, and yet in no single case has it ever been substantiated. The Times polled police officials across the country. Some believed that the BLA was a nationwide conspiracy. Most scoffed at the idea. Whatever was happening, the NYPD was taking no chances. The morning after the Imperato shootings, Mayor Lindsay approved the police commissioner's plan to flood the northern sections of Brooklyn with officers allotted 1,000 hours of overtime. Meanwhile, safely back in the Bronx, Chesimard, Zaid Shakur, and the others were incensed that the Imperato brothers had survived. They plotted a follow-up attack, this time determined to take a life. The reasoning being, Avon White told the NYPD months later, that the pigs did not die in Brooklyn. On the evening of Saturday, January 27th, 2 nights after the Imperato attack, the group split into 2 squads and walked out into the chilly night to hunt and kill a cop. Chesimard and Myers spent several hours canvassing the streets of the Bronx but were unable to find a suitable ambush target. The second group, the same trio who had attacked the Imperatos, took a stolen red GTO and patrolled Queens. Eventually, they parked on Baisley Boulevard in the St. Albans section and took their positions around an intersection, waiting for a patrol car to stop. Carney sagged inside a phone booth. Across the way, Hilton hid a machine pistol beneath his coat. Shakur watched the oncoming traffic, nursing a hidden shotgun. Finally, a little past midnight, a patrol car containing 2 officers stopped in their sights. All 3 men whipped out their guns and began firing. The driver, Officer Ray Paulina, ducked down and hit the gas, smashing into the fender of a car in front of him. A bullet grazed his forehead. As the firing continued, Paulina regained his senses and raced from the scene. His partner suffered a shoulder wound. Police would find 28 shell casings at the intersection. I mean, as is typical with these groups, like their firearms accuracy is not so good. You got maybe 1.5 hits out of 28 shots. I mean, that's atrocious accuracy. The next day, confronted by 2 attacks in 53 hours, the mayor threw out any pretense of diplomacy. At a press conference, Lindsay announced that an extra 6,000 officers were being hired at a cost of $13 million. Asked if he considered the BLA attacks a crisis situation, he replied, "When you have a pattern like these vicious attacks of police officers, I would call it a crisis. No one is going to rest until this group is arrested and brought to justice." Finally, the mayor is using his pattern recognition, I guess. The newspapers began to change their tone. On January 26th, in a story pegged to the police shootings in New Orleans, the Times headline had read, "Officials doubt a plot by blacks to kill white policemen." 3 mornings later, after 2 new BLA ambushes, the headline read, "Liberation Unit rated as murderous." This is just a general line about, if it happens once, it might be classified as an accident or a fluke. If it happens twice, it's more fool you. But if it happens 3 times, it's certainly enemy action, right? The furor over the BLA's sudden legitimization climaxed 2 weeks later, when New York Magazine published an excerpt from the forthcoming book called Target Blue. It was written by none other than Robert Daley, the NYPD's one-time spokesman. He had resigned. And while it covered many topics, the most explosive parts dealt with the BLA. Using information gleaned while in office, Daley laid bare the story of the 1971 New York and San Francisco attacks and argued they were the work of a single, nationwide militant group. For the first time, the debate over the BLA washed into the national press, though many writers and book reviewers remained skeptical. Well, yeah, of course, those people are all liberals. As Gerald M. Astor, who termed Daley a pistol-packin' flack with literary ambitions, noted in a review of Target Blue in Washington Monthly, conspiracy claims by the cops have a bad habit of collapsing. A top police investigator of the recent assaults has said of the conspiracy theory, a few dozen guys in different places happen to know each other and share a certain affinity, so one of them sits down at a typewriter and taps out BLA. But in numbers and in administrative structure, they don't make it an army. It's totally emergent, bro. What's the problem here? The irony was that Daley was largely correct. While hardly an army, the BLA was real, and it was a multi-state conspiracy, if a desperate and sloppy one. Right, so this is a problem with Daley's verbiage here, right? A conspiracy is when you say conspiracy, most people are going to think of the hub network, right? If you've ever seen organizations where basically you have a centralized committee or centralized leadership, like the Weather Underground, and then you have these spokes as on a wheel, basically on a wagon wheel, and all of the spokes report back to the leadership, and the leadership responds with directions. And that kind of a leadership structure is very useful in some situations, but it's also very centralized and very dependent on the leadership. So, of course, as the saying goes, you cut off the head of the snake, the body dies. That's pretty much what happens with that kind of a group. This particular structure, they don't have a huge national leadership. It is more emergent than, say, a Weather Underground type of radical group, but it does move in the same social circles. It is the same kind of, the same people broadly are going to overlap. So to say that these two organizations or these two cells, if you want to put it that way, are not the same or are not acting in the same broad thing or are using BLA as an overarching cause basically for and performing actions against the police for this particular cause is also incorrect. So the problem with what Daley is making a mistake, what he's facing here is that he's using the word conspiracy, which denotes a hub organization, when really he means network. This is a clear single network of people. And even if there's no centralized leadership, even if it's not exactly, even if it's very sloppy, it's still one movement and one thing. A very real thing. And it does act in broad coordination with itself. Where was I here? Yes. But the fact that the man promoting this idea was also promoting a book did little to convince the skeptics. Still, the growing acceptance of the BLA's existence, at least in New York, had an impact in the streets, where shootings by jittery policemen were becoming almost routine. Every day or two brought a new incident, most having nothing to do with the BLA. When gunfire struck a squad car on Long Island, the papers were filled with stories about the BLA invading the suburbs. It turned out to be a stray bullet from a firing range. A single day, March 6th, brought a pair of Bronx shootings. In the first, the police tried to stop a gypsy cab they believed had been carjacked. When the car pulled over, 3 men jumped out and sprayed the cruiser with gunfire. This may well have been Twyman Myers and 2 Confederates. And he gives a citation here. The headline is, "Police car blasted by Bronx gunmen," read the Daily News headline. 20 minutes earlier, a pair of patrolmen cruising 168th Street thought they recognized Myers. When they called him by name, he ran. At Franklin Avenue, he tried to flag a cab. When the cab wouldn't stop, Myers turned and fired a pistol at the pursuing officers. One, William Hoy, got out and chased Myers on foot through crowds to Fulton Avenue until, after running for blocks, Myers vanished. "It was him," Hoy said later. "I know his picture better than my own kids." I mean, that's exactly what cops do, don't they? There's a reason why cops have exceptionally high divorce rates as a profession. In those tense late winter weeks, BLA soldiers emerged as New York's new boogeymen, spotted at every robbery, blamed for every unexplained shooting. Myers was one of 3 BLA soldiers named in the April 10 robbery of a bank on Northern Boulevard in Queens. Another, named Victor Cumberbatch, was so spooked that he pulled a gun on 2 telephone repairmen, thinking they were police. The Brooklyn district attorney tried to indict him for kidnapping. Other soldiers were blamed for a string of supermarket and bodega robberies. When a new police commissioner, Donald F. Cawley, took office that April, one of his first actions was to summon the chief of detectives, Lois Cottle, into his Center Street office and make clear his top priority. "The Black Liberation Army," Cawley growled. "Get the bastards." He added, "Louis, think big." Cottle, in turn, brought in a plumpish, sandy-haired deputy chief named Harold Shriver, a 27-year NYPD veteran. Given wide latitude to apprehend the BLA's leadership, Shriver consolidated the 3 detective squads working BLA cases. To analyze the myriad threads of information the squads had gathered, he hit upon the novel idea of entering it all into a Hazeltine 2000 computer he arranged for the department to rent. 2 detectives were sent to training courses to figure out how to use it. Detectives were still mastering the computer's intricacies when, on May 2nd, the word came from New Jersey. It was Joanne Chesimard. Right, so obviously, we've seen this pattern with the Weather Underground, right? They can't use conventional methods for one reason or another. Those methods are ineffective for one reason or another, and they have to start using creative methods and newer methods that have not been used before. And so obviously cataloging everything in a computer database makes, even if in this early stage of computing requires you to input everything manually into a system in files and organized by hand basically on the computer, it's still going to be faster for recall purposes than having pen and paper and actual like file cabinets and all of that. Later, there would be considerable speculation about where they were headed. The BLA's last 2 intellectual leaders, Joanne Chesimard and the little Zaid Shakur, the field mouse who was a long way from the moment when Jane Fonda bailed him out of jail 3 years before. Some said they were heading to hide with family members in Philadelphia or Atlantic City. Others thought they were en route to Washington. Their destination, however, was beside the point. What mattered was their desperate need to escape the police dragnet in New York and the poor choices they made that night of May 2nd in order to do so. In fact, they were breaking every rule of underground survival. They were driving in a car, They were driving at night. And worst of all, they were driving on the New Jersey Turnpike, a highway, then as now, where state troopers had a reputation for stopping and searching cars driven by black men. A little before midnight, they drove out of the city and stopped their battered white Pontiac Le Mans for snacks at the Alexander Hamilton rest stop north of Newark. 45 minutes later, at 12:45, they were speeding south, passing through the central New Jersey city of New Brunswick, when they saw the trooper behind them, lights rolling. Their driver, a one-time Panther named Clark Squire, pulled to the side of the highway. The trooper, 29-year-old James M. Harper, called for backup even before approaching the car, which was standard procedure. He later said he stopped the car because it had a faulty tail light. A second trooper, 35-year-old Werner Forster, pulled up moments later. As it happened, the three cars were now lined up barely 200 yards south of State Police headquarters. Trooper Harper took Squire's driver's license, then asked him to stand behind the car with Trooper Forster. Harper next leaned into the car to examine the serial number on the driver's side door. As he did, he noticed that the woman sitting in the front seat seemed fidgety. The small, light-skinned man in the back seat sat frozen, his eyes glassy. Suddenly, from behind the car, Forster said, "Jim, look what I found." Harper looked back and saw Forster holding up a clip from an automatic pistol. He quickly turned his attention back to the man and woman inside the car and told them not to move. He saw Joanne Chesimard reach beneath her right leg. A moment later, the gun was in her hand. She fired from barely 3 feet away. Her eyes were wide open. Her teeth were showing, Harper testified months later. She fired a shot. I felt the pain in my shoulder. Staggering, Harper managed to draw his revolver and fire several shots into the car, striking both Chesimard and Zaid Shakur. One bullet struck Shakur flush in the chest, mortally wounding him. Behind the car, Clark, Squire, and Trooper Forster began grappling. At some point, Squire grabbed Forster's gun and shot him in the head. Harper, now outnumbered 3-1, ran for the headquarters building. As he did, Squire jumped back in the Le Mans and drove off. When Harper reached the building, he managed to say, "I've been shot," before collapsing. A description of the Le Mans was immediately broadcast. Minutes later, a trooper saw it parked on the side of the turnpike, 5 miles south. As he screeched to a stop, he saw a man running away toward a wooded area. He yelled for him to halt, then fired a wild shot when he didn't. Squire was found hiding in nearby woods the next day. The trooper found Chesimard lying beside the car, bleeding lightly from a wound in the chest, and Shakur, who was dead. Chesimard was taken to a hospital, where she recovered. The next day, Joanne Chesimard's face, puffy with full lips and a medium afro, stared out from the front of every New York newspaper. The daily news coverage spread across 6 pages, 2 just of photos. It was a singular moment in underground history, the first time the press was obliged to introduce and attempt to explain a black revolutionary, and an attractive woman at that, to a mainstream audience. The Daily News termed Chesimard not only the high priestess of the cop-hating Black Liberation Army, but a Black Joan of Arc. The Times called her the soul of the BLA. Yet even then, the news failed to catch the national imagination. As it had from the start, the BLA remained largely a New York story. It would take time for Chesimard's legend to spread. 2 contrasting funerals ensued. In East Brunswick, New Jersey, the governor led a crowd of 3,500 mourners at Trooper Werner Forster's simple 20-minute service. His body was taken to a cemetery in a procession of 500 police cars. Meanwhile, in Harlem, Zaid Shakur, his body was wrapped in a white shroud, lay in state at the Marcus Jackson Funeral Home. Hundreds of people, almost all of them black, filed past. Flyers outside urged readers to support the Black Liberation Army. "The blood was no super nigger or a superstar, at a BLA communique announced. He was just a nigger that was tired of the racist pig cops shooting down unarmed brothers and sisters in the streets. The nigger felt the correct method for obtaining liberation here in Babylon was through revolutionary violence. We will bury our dead, clean our guns, and prepare for the next battle. Those are hard R's, by the way, in case I wasn't sufficiently emphasizing it, but that is what the text says. Joanne Chesimard's capture was a crushing blow for the dozen or so BLA members still hiding in New York. Eldridge Cleaver's one-time courier, Denise Oliver, now living underground with the BLA's Andrew Jackson, wrote of their mounting desperation in a diary the NYPD later discovered. Each day only brings more bad news, more deaths, more captures, she wrote. Old friends hit the dust, and we are helpless, in touch with nothing but the TV, sexless, but comrades. The day after Chesimard's captured, she wrote, I don't know if Jackson turning himself in is the answer, but to keep running seems futile. In the end, jail or death is the revolution. So why postpone it? Corbin says, sounds familiar. What sounds familiar, Corbin? Is that Chesimard talking that sounds familiar, or is that the previous Black Liberation stuff? Moving on. Both the FBI and the NYPD, now working together, sense the momentum shifting. In my view, the BLA and related groups are hard-pressed to find the type of home base support they need to conduct their terrorist tactics at this time. New York's police commissioner, Don Colley, wrote in a memo to his top men on May 30th. In short, they are on the run and appear to be leaderless. The best defense is a good offense. We should quickly move forward and place as much pressure on these revolutionaries as possible. Okay. Yeah, okay, Corbin says the previous stuff. Yeah, some things never change there, Corbin. Suddenly, doors began opening. That spring, either just before or after Chesimard's capture, 3 FBI agents who had been working BLA cases since the beginning, Jim Murphy, Bob McCartan, and a youngster named Danny Coulson, secured an informant. We really believed in pursuing informants. That had been our highest priority for 2 years, McCartan recalls, and finally, we got one. The informant was a jailed BLA member's girlfriend. She too faced charges and began cooperating with the FBI to avoid them. Her identity, which has never been revealed, is being withheld here as well. The woman is alive today and in her 60s. Interesting. But of course, that's the pattern that you have to use when doing police work, right? What usually breaks these kinds of cases wide open is you already have somebody involved in this network who are in prison or already suffering charges, and then you give them some kind of sweetheart deal in exchange for giving information. Corbin says, the police are killing unarmed black men. Well, I mean, body cam footage really, really disproves a lot of these narratives, doesn't it? Moving on. The informant, who remained in contact with several other group members' companions, furnished tips that allowed the FBI to identify a series of BLA hideouts and rendezvous points. The first involved a meeting between 2 of the BLA's most wanted members, Freddie Hilton and Twyman Myers, the teenagers who had assassinated Officer James Green in Atlanta in 1971. The pair was planning to meet on the morning of June 7th on New Lots Avenue in Brooklyn. Both the FBI and the NYPD were waiting. A vivid glimpse of what happened next was given in Danny Coulson's 1999 memoir, No Heroes. The FBI contingent was holed up in an elderly gentleman's apartment across the street. I don't take to no cop killers, the man explained, so you can use the place. A group of NYPD detectives dressed as a construction crew sprawled across a stoop down the street. As the FBI men watched, the cops cracked open 2 six-packs of beer and lazily passed them around. Up and down the street, FBI agents and NYPD officers crawled into sniper positions along the rooftops. A few minutes before 11, Freddie Hilton appeared, as promised. I mean, just a pause right here. Like, the fact that you can have a bunch of construction workers, like, crack open beer on basically on the job or on their break during a job, it's just the amount of culture that has changed in the last 6 years is ridiculous. A few minutes before 11, Freddie Hilton appeared as promised. He walked halfway up the block and peered down toward the construction crew, which made a little show of guzzling their beers. I mean, the fact that this is believable is just ridiculous. It just shows you, goes to show you. In the apartment above, Danny Coulson took out a .308 caliber Remington sniper rifle and trained it on Hilton's chest. Through the scope, he could make out the slight bulge on Hilton's hip. "Murph," he radioed Jim Murphy. "Put it out that he has a pistol in his waistband, left side, butt forward." Suddenly, the distant cry of a police siren could be heard. As the FBI man exchanged glances, it drew nearer. On the sidewalk, Hilton glanced up and down the street, then studied the surrounding buildings. Coulson eased back into the darkened apartment. As each moment passed, the siren grew nearer until, to Coulson's dismay, a patrol car appeared at the head of the street. "Shit, there it is, down to our left," the FBI man whispered. Once again, Coulson trained his rifle on Hilton's chest, ready to fire if he made a move toward the approaching car. As the others watched, the patrol car slid down the street. As it approached Hilton, he edged into the shadow of a doorway. The car passed him and came to a stop 60 feet beyond, in front of the building at 440 New Lots. Hilton stepped out of the doorway and watched as two uniformed officers got out, trotted up the steps, and disappeared inside. With Coulson's rifle still trained on his chest, Hilton, evidently curious, sauntered down toward the patrol car. As he did, shots rang out from the rooftop. Hilton jumped in surprise, then craned his neck skyward. He never saw the two NYPD detectives who barreled into him from behind, tackling him to the pavement. It took several minutes for everyone to understand what had happened. As it turned out, a woman living at 440 New Lots had seen plainclothes officers on her roof and, mistaking them for burglars, called out the Liberty Avenue station, which dispatched the patrol cars. The responding officers crept up a stairwell to the roof entry where, through the crack of a door, they glimpsed what appeared to be a man pointing a shotgun at them. One officer fired 3 shots through the door, hitting 44-year-old William Jakes of the Major Case Squad in the stomach. "We're police officers," the men on the roof shouted. The officer in the stairwell tossed his police hat through the door. A badge came whistling down the stairs in response. It was friendly fire. Fred Hilton was handcuffed, bundled into a police car, and taken for fingerprinting, in which he was shoved into a car full of FBI men for the short drive to a federal magistrate. "So who are you guys?" Hilton asked at one point. Coulson, Murphy, and the others introduced themselves. "Oh, I heard of you guys," Hilton said, daring a smile. "We know who's chasing us, you know." "Fred," Coulson said, "if you know our names, why didn't you just call us and surrender? Our number's in the book, you know." "You guys just don't get it, do you?" Hilton snapped. "We're at war. The people are at war with this fascist government. I'm a soldier on my side, and you guys are soldiers on your side, and we won't ever surrender." Coulson twisted to face him. "No, Freddie, we're not at war. If we were at war, you'd have a great big hole in your chest from my rifle." Fred Hilton said no more. Once again, Twyman Myers had gotten away, but later that day, Jim Murphy got a follow-up tip from their informant, this one on the BLA's dashing Andrew Jackson. According to the informant, Jackson was holed up with Denise Oliver in a flat on 158th and Amsterdam Avenue in Harlem. FBI agents surrounded the building the next morning. Jim Murphy and another agent swung a battering ram, knocking the apartment's door off its hinges. An agent named Errol Myers barged inside, then into the bedroom, where Jackson was in bed with Oliver. Slowly, he put up his hands. "Don't shoot, man," he said. "Don't shoot." After 3 high-profile arrests orchestrated by the FBI, it was time for the NYPD's retooled, computerized BLA squad to make its mark. The good news, as far as Chief Harold Shriver was concerned, was that there were only a handful of hardened BLA soldiers still at large. The bad news was that they were the most desperate and dangerous of all. In mid-September, days after the one-time Panther Herman Bell and several others were arrested for a string of bank robberies in New Orleans, the New York Transit Police received a tip that a BLA soldier named Robert Seth Hayes, wanted for shooting a transit cop that June, was holed up in a tenement apartment at 1801 Bryant Avenue in the Bronx. Surveillance suggested that a number of people appeared to be living with him, including 3 women and at least 1 infant. Early in the evening of September 17th, police quietly surrounded the building. The apartment, a double-sized unit with doors labeled B and C, was on the first floor. Just before 8 o'clock, a group of 9 NYPD detectives carrying battering rams hustled inside the building and rushed the 2 doors. Door B, a metal door, refused to budge. After 2 strikes from a battering ram, neither would door C. At that point, someone inside the apartment opened fire with a shotgun. One final heave of the battering ram, and door C flew open. 6 detectives rushed into the dim apartment, whose sole adornment appeared to be a poster of George Jackson on one wall. Hayes emerged from a bedroom, holding a shotgun at his waist. He fired, striking a detective named Melvin Betty in the hand. Betty staggered back into the corridor. The apartment erupted in gunfire as Hayes disappeared back into the bedroom, the detectives firing wildly in his direction. Inside, a woman began screaming, my baby is in here!" It was bedlam. 2 detectives tried to duck inside the living room, only to be driven back by fire from an unseen gunman. Hayes poked his shotgun out from the bedroom door and fired another blast. A pair of detectives grabbed the smoking barrel, pushed Hayes back inside the room, and tackled him on a bed as a woman and her 17-day-old daughter screamed in a corner. For a moment, the apartment went silent. Detectives furiously reloaded their weapons, at one point sliding pistols across the floor to beef up their arsenal. Suddenly, a detective named Maximo Jimenez, struck by a glancing bullet in the buttocks, saw something rolling out of the living room toward him. It was a smoke bomb. Thinking fast, Jimenez reached out his foot and kicked it back into the living room, which began to fill with smoke. "We were shouting things like, 'You're surrounded! Throw out your guns and come out with your hands up,'" one detective later told the Daily News. What they shouted back wasn't printable. After several more staccato exchanges of gunfire, someone from within the living room shouted, "We give up." Coughing and hacking, 2 BLA soldiers, Melvin Carney, wanted in connection with the police shootings early that year, and Avon White, walked out with hands in the air. The trio's 3 girlfriends eventually scurried out through the smoke as well. 3 detectives were wounded. In a press conference afterward, Police Commissioner Cawley, overjoyed, called the raid a monumental event. It was almost over. With most of the BLA now off the streets, the head of the major case squad, Harold Shriver, decided to make an all-out effort to bring in the last and deadliest of its gunmen, Twyman Myers. The morning after the Bronx gunfight, the FBI named him to its 10 most wanted fugitive list. Leads came in slowly, most on buildings in the South Bronx where Myers had been seen. They found apartments on 117th and 118th Streets that he had used months before. Finally, in October, they unearthed a hideout on 116th Street that hadn't been reoccupied in the weeks since Myers had left. The apartment was filthy, strewn with trash, and infested with rats. In the garbage, detectives found a receipt for a money order issued by a store in the Bronx. At the store, a clerk handed over the original order, made out to a real estate company. A visit to the real estate company revealed that the money had been used to rent an apartment at 263 West 118th Street, which also had not been reoccupied since Myers had last used it. Inside, detectives found a copy of the Amsterdam News with the page carrying apartment listings torn out. They concluded that Myers was using it to rent his hideouts. Unfortunately, there were more than 100 such listings in every issue, far too many to canvass. Then, on November 7th, came the break. One of Myers' bank-robbing partners, Joe Lee Jones, surrendered to the FBI on an old charge of deserting from the Army. NYPD detectives interrogated him the next day. Jones, who was deathly afraid of Myers, said Myers moved apartments every few weeks. He had no idea where he was, but he mentioned a remark by Myers' girlfriend in which he spoke of moving into a freshly painted flat. Detectives checked the Amsterdam News. Only 11 places were advertised as newly painted. It took 6 days to rule out 10 of them. On November 14th, they discreetly interviewed neighbors around the 11th. A third-floor set of rooms in a tenement at 625 Tinton Avenue in the Bronx. From their descriptions, the occupants had to be Myers and his girlfriend. Both the NYPD and the FBI sent every man they had. By early afternoon, when the girlfriend left the building and was positively identified, there were nearly 150 policemen and federal agents in the area, about a dozen undercover men on Tinton Avenue itself. Armed with flak jackets, shotguns, and automatic weapons, they were ready for war. The day stretched on with no sign of Myers. Finally, around 7:15 p.m., a man wearing a ski cap emerged from the building. He looked like Myers. It was, in fact, Myers. Unaware of the small army around him, he strolled around the corner onto 152nd Street, then disappeared into a bodega. When he came out, a detective named Colonel Holland was closest to him. Holland knew that Myers usually carried an automatic pistol beneath his coat. When Myers turned down the street, Holland stepped forward, grabbed his arm, and barked, "Freeze! Police!" Myers wheeled. His eyes met Holland's and widened. He took 2 steps back, pulled a 9mm submachine gun, and opened fire. Holland rolled to the pavement and shot back. The quiet Bronx neighborhood exploded as FBI men and plainclothesmen up and down the street drew their guns and fired. Wounded, Myers wildly fired his 9mm, then frantically drew a second submachine gun from beneath his coat. It was no use. No one could have survived the blizzard of bullets directed his way. Twywan Myers, out for a stroll on a cold New York night, was cut to pieces. Justice! His funeral in Harlem made a deep impression on any number of white radicals who attended. The young Italian émigré Silvia Baraldini, who would later rob banks alongside black militants, gave a friend a religious icon to place inside the coffin. You had to run this gauntlet of police sharpshooters to go into the funeral, she remembers. Seeing all these sharpshooters on practically every rooftop in Harlem, you realized there really was a war going on. I think that was the day I decided to join them. Like, I'm sorry, but aren't these people all like communists who don't believe in religion? Like, why is she giving him a religious icon for his funeral? Like, why? Like, even to place inside the coffin. Like, and exactly which religious icon, I wonder. And which religion? Interesting questions that remain unanswered here. It was over, the shooting at least. A few stragglers would pull a bank job or two in the coming months, but the BLA's days as a legitimate urban guerrilla force were at an end. The trials of its members would stretch on for years, with 1 or 2 serving as rallying points for what remained of the radical underground. The memory of the BLA itself blurred and then dimmed, and then, in the minds of an American public that took little notice of it anyway, winked out altogether. Even in custody, BLA fighters refused to surrender. Henry Shaw Brown, captured in St. Louis, managed to escape but was recaptured a week later. Melvin Carney, held on the 8th floor of the Brooklyn House of Detention, tied together bedsheets and shimmied out a window, only to fall to his death when they unraveled. That's funny. Serves him right. 42 years later, 6 one-time BLA fighters remain alive in U.S. prisons. The murders of Greg Foster and Rocco Lowry of the NYPD remain officially unsolved. Of the dozens of one-time Panthers who served in the BLA, only a handful would soldier on, and only one would make his mark doing so. In 1973, still a fugitive, still the only veteran of Eldridge Cleaver's Algerian adventure, vowing to continue the struggle, the man known as Sekou Odinga melted into the shadows of New York City, and with a handful of recruits, began robbing banks. And that is the end of Chapter 11, as well as Part 2. Part 3 is called The Second Wave. And as we've mentioned before, just now, this is the saga of Sekou Odinga and the Symbionese Liberation Army that we will get to next time. Before we end the stream, I just want to call attention once again to these 6 BLA fighters that remain alive in U.S. prisons. I would imagine that under the Biden administration, we should look to see who exactly gets pardoned. It would not surprise me that of those who still survive, that they are going to be pardoned by the outgoing Biden administration, or they will be pardoned after, possibly if Kamala is elected. So we should look for that, because these people are very, very good at ensuring that you have to take care of your radicals, basically. You have to take care of them. And the left is much better at doing this than the right is, because they can get liberals to pardon extremely radical people. And we've seen that many, many times before with the Clinton administration, especially. So I would suggest that somebody look at that. But anyway, with that, the stream is basically concluded. Next time we'll have to get to Chapter 12. It's going to be another chapter about Black radicalism. And if you notice the patterns of Black radicalism, you can see that it's a lot more violent, right? And this is something I want to harp on, is that the patterns of violence here is that the quote-unquote white radicals, or you might even say the more white and Jewish radicals, the college-educated types of the Weather Underground, they're much more, they're much less violent, they're much less overtly criminal, which allows them to reclassify themselves as a sort of Robin Hood figure. And the Black radicals are much, much more violent, much more criminal. And I think that we can begin to see exactly the outline of the necessity of the Black population in the United States for the intersectional coalition, for this progressive rainbow coalition. And I think that there's a reason for that, is because you need to attack the cops. You need to have the white radicals do symbolic, high visibility attacks on American infrastructure, in addition to all these other things that they're doing at the same time. So I think that there's a reason why the Black population is so sacred to modern progressives, and I think that this is one of the reasons why, is because they're actually doing the symbolic and physical attacks on American law enforcement. I think that's exactly why they're one reason among many why they're so sacred, which is to say that progressives are indeed the real racist, and the unique qualities that make Blacks what they are is what makes them so sacred to the Progressive Coalition, in effect. So with that, I would like to briefly give a quick shill. You can check out my Buy Me a Coffee page if you like this stuff, and if you want to drop me a couple bucks. I greatly appreciate it. This channel is not monetized, and I don't expect it to be anytime soon. So Yes, my monetization paths are either on my Substack subscriptions or through Buy Me a Coffee. So just please, if you could contribute anything, it greatly offsets the cost of me taking the time to do this and makes it more than just a hobby. So thanks once again for tuning in, everybody. Good. Have a good day.